Sydney-based Linda Jaivin is the author of 12 books, including the erotic and wickedly funny bestseller, Eat Me. But she's also a renowned sinologist, which led to her newest book, The Shortest History of China.
With China, you get every aspect of human experience. It's got a unifying culture in one way, but it's got a very diverse culture in another way. There's so many subcultures, local subcultures, linguistic subcultures, ethnic subcultures. There's people, who are extremely learned. There are illiterate peasants. So you get every type of human experience, every type of human being in one package.
In this edition of Conversations, Linda Jaivin sits down with the director of the Australia-China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University, Professor Jing Han. The Foundation for Australian Studies in China acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which this interview was conducted.
Hello everyone, welcome to join us. It is our great honour and privilege to have Linda Jaivin as our guest today to this conversation. Linda is a highly acclaimed writer in Australia, one of the finest and most versatile writers in Australia, and I must add, one of the most surprising ones as well. From an erotic novel to the history of China, you can see the surprising range of writing by Linda. Apart from being a highly accomplished novelist and writer, Linda is also a highly regarded sinologist, having worked and lived in mainland China and Hong Kong and Taiwan for many years. Her master and knowledge of Chinese literature, Chinese language, Chinese culture, and Chinese history keep amazing many of us. Linda, of course, is also very well known for her translation of Chinese literature and Chinese film subtitling, which is a very specialized craft, which I have enjoyed in my career. There are so many aspects to Linda's talent and remarkable achievements. Today's conversation will be focused on Linda's writing. Hello, Linda.
Hello, Jing, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it.
You definitely deserve it. More than that. You were born in the United States to a Jewish family of Russian heritage. You then undertook Chinese studies at Brown University in Rhode Island in the 1970s. And then your interest in Chinese language and culture led you to Taiwan in 1977. And then you went to Hong Kong in 1979 and worked as a reporter for Asia Week magazine. From there, you went to Beijing and lived there and worked there on and off for many years.
I'm wondering who you work for, Jing.
Also, in 1986, I've done my homework, you came to Australia and became an Australian citizen. So you can see many aspects and many backgrounds and cultural history and continents as well. So my first question is, who do you think you are when it comes to writing?
Oh my gosh, that's quite a question. I'm a bit of a Jill of all trades and probably a master of none. I do float along, and I'm very interested. My thing when I write is I always want to do something new that challenges myself in a different way. I don't like repeating myself. I don't like going along the same track. If I did, I'd probably be a lot richer. Because there was certainly enough pressure on me to follow up Eat Me with another comic, erotic, feminist work of fiction. But I felt I've done that. I had been at a million different writers' festivals around the world answering the question, what's the difference between erotica and pornography? And I'd used the same joke so many times, I had to keep myself from rolling my eyes as I did it. And the joke, by the way, was I would quote Woody Allen, and he would always say, erotica uses a feather, pornography the whole chicken.
Very good one.
So I'm always looking for a new challenge. And that probably describes me best as a writer. I'm also always interested in mapping places, whether it's fictionally or historically. I'm very interested in the relationship of place and the people who live there and the culture that comes from that.
Let's come back to your first novel, Eat Me. And when the book was published, you were 40. So it's not early start as such. Did you always want to be a novelist? I know you were a writer, and it took all this time to prepare yourself, or you sort of get into fictional writing by chance?
I always wanted to be a writer, but I never thought I had the capability. I didn't think I had any talent. I read so much and I knew so many great books. I was always reading such great books that I thought I could never do this. But at the same time, I was really interested. So I wrote a lot of poetry in my early 20s. I was living in Taiwan. I started a novel. I had this very fancy idea for how it was going to be constructed. It was complete garbage. So I threw it away. Then in my later 20s, I wrote another novel. All this time I'm writing short stories, not publishing them, just, poems, trying to get published. As I told an audience at the Blue Mountains Writers Festival recently, when I was younger, I had a really intense correspondence with the New Yorker. Because of my poetry. I said I would send them my poems and they would send me back a rejection letter. And this went on for quite some time. But, I was always writing. And when I was in my late 20s, I started another novel. I went quite far with it. And then a novel came out. It was a kind of a post-nuclear Holocaust, mutants creating their own. A novel came out. I'm trying to remember the name of it, that was exactly that. Became a huge worldwide success. I was like, well, that's not going to work. Threw that one out. Then in the mid-1980s, I started another novel. And I was quite a really amateur. I mean, for all the good books I'd read, I hadn't absorbed much. So I wrote this novel set in China in the 1980s, in the few years that were most familiar to me, very interesting years. And I think I sent it around to like one publisher or two publishers and rejected. But that one I put on the shelf. For some reason, I didn't throw it away. And actually, that's the novel I'm working on now. Again, rewriting it completely. So that the fact that Eat Me was the first one published, it wasn't the first one I wrote or tried to write.
Very interesting. It's very insightful. So let's get back to this first novel. And Amazon describes Eat Me as an outrageous, irresistible, and utterly original debut.
Oh, that's very sweet of them.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading it and really found it surprising.
Naughty girl.
Oh, I found it surprising on many levels. It says a lot more than what the label or category says erotic indicates. Because you have such ability that successfully integrated the funny and juicy stories into very serious discussions of gender, political, social, intercultural issues. And it is funny, witty, satirical, intelligent, as well as erotic.
Thank you. That's very kind.
And it explores and challenges fundamental questions such as sexual exploitation versus sexual empowerment, eroticism versus feminism, and physical pleasure versus intellectual pursuit. So, and then the novel became an instant bestseller in Australia and France, but it was banned in some parts of the United States. Anyway, my question is, how did you decide to write Eat Me?
I was just having fun in the beginning. I wrote a couple of dirty stories for my own amusement, and I showed one to a friend of mine, who's now a publisher, actually, Kathy Bale, and she said, "Oh my God, that's very funny. Why don't you send it to Australian Women's Forum?" I didn't even know about this magazine. It was a very sex-positive feminist magazine, and they had like a centerfold with a naked man every month, and they published erotic fiction. So I thought, okay, so I'd written it in about an hour. I fixed it up a little bit. I sent it in and they published it. And at the time I was writing articles about Chinese film and all this stuff, articles that took a lot of basically a lot of background and a lot of knowledge to write, and I'd be paid, $200, $300, for an article that really involved. And I tossed off this story really quickly, and back came the biggest check I'd ever seen at that point for anything. And I was like, I think I've seen the future. So I sat down, I wrote a whole bunch more. And that first story had the 4 characters of Eat Me, the basics of them. And then I talked to the magazine. They were like, oh, we like variety, so we don't want to do a whole series. Even as much as we like that, we don't want to do that whole series. I was like, okay. And then, I don't know, another inspiration came up. I was always looking for something that amused me and turned me on. And I couldn't, I kind of ran out of really good material because at the time, there wasn't that much feminist erotica. There was almost nothing really, and nothing funny. You know what I mean? And so anyway, I wrote another story, really dirty, pushing it. And I put it aside on my desk and forgot about it. About a year later, I found it and I thought, that's actually quite funny. I think I showed it again to Kathy. She and her partner made a couple suggestions, half an hour of revision. And again, back comes the check. At around this time, I was approached by a publisher from Text Publishing, and they were thinking, oh, do you have a book-length essay in you? Maybe something about China, maybe this, maybe that. And I said, well, I think I've got a pornographic novel. And so Michael from Text was like, oh, okay. So, well, and we talked about it, and they offered me the tiniest little advance, and they expected to publish 2,000 copies, and we all expected it to just sink like a rock, and then I could get on with my serious stuff. And instead, before it came out, there were orders for 6,000. And within 7 months, we had sold like 30,000, and it was on the bestseller list, and it was going in America, and it was big in France and in Italy and all these other places. It was kind of like, oh my God, that's very funny. But it just started out as just self-amusement.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And also it tells a lot about your writing and you as surprising. That's what I meant. Serious at one side and funny on the other side. And then the following year, 1996, you published your second novel called Rock and Roll Babes from Outer Space, which is described as a hilarious erotic romp, presenting an eye-popping ride of the 3 funniest and sexiest aliens who have found drugs, sex, and rock and roll on the planet Earth. And you have this extraordinary ability of interweaving your very bold imagination into the presentation of the very real world we all live in. And your fictional world, as I just mentioned, is both serious and hilarious and funny at the same time. Is this an approach that you decided to take on early in your writing?
I think it was pretty organic. I tend to like to look at the funnier side of things. I love satirical writing. I think when I was younger, I hoovered up all of Evelyn Waugh's work. I loved Salman Rushdie's first books when they came out. Anything that had that sort of ability to combine politics, look on comedy of manners. I love comedies of manners. And then, as I was saying before, I like to map places. So Eat Me kind of mapped Darlinghurst. I was new to Sydney. I'd come from Canberra, and I was understanding my neighborhood. And so the cafes and who sat at which cafe and how did it all kind of fit together. And so that was a mapping. And then with Rock and Roll Babes from Outer Space, because I was spending a lot of time in Newtown, hearing bands. I had some friends who were in bands, and they always used to stay with me. And then I used to sit on the door at the old Sandringham hotel when they were playing, and I used to be the one to collect the money. And hilarious things would happen. Like, I remember there was a very funny band that I used to do this for, rock and roll, but also kind of crazy and funny. And I remember one person came up to get into the band. I think it was like $5. I mean, or $3. I mean, it was really ridiculous, It was in the 90s. And I remember one person came up and they said, I don't have any money, but I've got a pair of very large underpants for the band. I said, okay, I'll take it, And I put that into Rock and Roll Babes from Outer Space, which draws a lot on, I was mapping Newtown, as a place of rock and roll, as a place of, at the time, there was this whole cultural thing about slackerdom. And of course, that was the time of the X-Files, and everybody was totally into the X-Files. So I began looking at how rock and roll and alien obsessions intersected, and there was quite a lot of it. And, and I created this thing. And it was funny because it was a very silly novel. It's a very, very silly romp of a novel. But I would get these people, these young kids, like from Newtown going, oh, that was my life. I love that novel. I was like, it's so funny. It just did strike a chord, despite being, just quite silly, just a romp,
But in the meantime, it's quite satirical. So, so I think that part is actually quite critical in understanding your stories. Kind of a hidden serious part.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And again, obsessions with gender roles and so on show up because the aliens were the product of sexual experimentation with human beings. And so they were hybrids, and they only knew Earth through rock and roll, which they kind of picked up on radio waves and things. And so all of their understanding about Earth and life on Earth came through rock and roll, which is hilarious if you kind of think about it in the perspectives and stuff. So they steal a spaceship and they come to Earth. And one of the things about rock is that, with some fantastic exceptions, some of my favorite people like Patti Smith and PJ Harvey and, Courtney Love, and, there's many people and more now, of course. But rock and roll was very male. It's overwhelmingly, it began as a very male thing. So these alien chicks came to Earth with an understanding of life and how to approach it that was a rock and roll male approach to life. And I played with that. They didn't understand, they didn't see things as somebody who'd been acculturated female on Earth would have seen things. And it was very liberating, and it was quite fun to put that into the story.
And then you went on to publish Miles Walker, You Are Dead, and Dead Sexy. And one of the reviewer of your book, Dead Sexy, actually said, Jaivin can satirize human pretensions, insecurities, and other foibles with insight and verve. So can you elaborate on your satirical bent in your observation and creative representation of the human world?
I think it's just how I see things. If I'm in a situation and then later I'm talking about the situation, I always find the funnier bits. Or if something really weird happens, somebody's incredibly rude or whatever, I also can find that quite funny after I've been sort of like, yeah.
And being a sinologist, so it's not surprising that at least three of your 7 novels are set in Chinese history and Chinese culture explicitly. And like this one, the Most Immoral Woman, and that tells a tale of Australian journalist George Ernest Morris' love affair in China against the backdrop of a Russo-Japan war in 1904. And also this book, The Empress Lover, that unfolds a parallel interwoven tales of Sir Edmund Backhouse with Empress Dowager Cixi, and an Australian film translator in the contemporary China. I wonder who that person is. And also in Eat Me, a cultural exchange program that led one of the four main characters, Julia, to her erotic and cultural experience in China. What's there in China's cultural history or language that fascinates you?
Pretty much everything. And the reason is China is such a big place. Probably only India could compare with it in this way. But I feel like with China, you get every aspect of human experience. You get the best, the worst, the craziest, the strangest, the most, centered, focused, the most beautiful people and the most kind of awful. Do you know what I mean? Because it is such a big place. It's not because of anything else. It's got a unifying culture in one way, but it's got a very diverse culture in another way. There's so many subcultures, local subcultures, linguistic subcultures, ethnic subcultures. There's people, who are extremely learned. There are illiterate peasants. So you get every type of human experience, every type of human being in one package. I think that's why I am so drawn to it.
In part 2 of our interview with Linda Jaivin, she reveals the level of research required to ensure an authentic novel.